I was still holding the dessert platter when her mother squeezed my arm and whispered, "You must be so proud. Emmett's promotion means Elise can finally stop pretending she married the right man," and the polished silver lid slipped, clanging against the hardwood like a judge's gavel that had waited 4 years to fall. I felt the sound travel up my wrist and lodge somewhere in my throat. Tasting of metal and raspberries, I'd candied myself because Elise said her family loved a man who could cook. Around us the dining room kept sparkling. Crystal, laughter, the low hum of a playlist her father approved. But the air had already shifted, like someone had opened a freezer behind my back and forgotten to close it again. Elise stood across the table refilling her brother's wine, spine straight in the navy dress we bought together last spring, and when her eyes met mine they flicked away faster than a candle you regret lighting. I waited for the correction that never came, for her to tell her mother she'd misspoken, that pride was meant for the husband standing beside her with raspberry stains blooming across his white shirt like fresh shame. Instead she smiled, small, practiced, the same smile she used when her father toasted the real men who carried briefcases instead of tool belts, and I understood the platter had only been a test of weight I was never meant to pass. I bent to gather the lid, fingers suddenly too big for delicate silver, and heard Emmett's name repeated like a corporate hymn. Senior VP, stock options. The corner office Elise used to joke she'd trade for a porch that creaked in the wind. They spoke about him as if he were already seated at the head of the table, as if the chair I'd occupied for every birthday and funeral were placeholder furniture awaiting final delivery. When I straightened, Elise's father clinked his glass and proposed a toast to futures that finally make sense, and every face turned toward me expecting agreement, expecting applause, expecting the carpenter to keep sanding his own edges until he fit the blueprint they'd drawn without him. I swallowed, nodded, set the platter on the sideboard with the same care I used settling maple boards into dovetail joints, but the wood of my voice had split and I couldn't find a clamp wide enough to hold it together. The conversation rolled on, mortgage rates, vacation homes, the inevitable wedding that would require a venue both grand and tasteful, and I became a spectator to my own marriage, watching the woman who once danced barefoot with me on construction plywood now aligning her plans with a future I hadn't been invited to architect. Later, in the guest bathroom that smelled of eucalyptus and money, I stared at my reflection and practiced breathing the way I did before big client presentations, but the man in the mirror looked borrowed, beard too wild, shirt too plain, hands too scarred to cradle the crystal stemware Elise's mother collected like trophies. I could still hear them through the vent, her sister asking if Emmett would make it for dessert, her mother answering, "He's on his way, traffic willing," as though his arrival were weather, unpredictable but certain in season. When I emerged, Elise cornered me by the pantry, whispering, "Don't sulk, you'll embarrass them," and the phrase landed like a nail I hadn't seen coming, driving deep into grain I'd assumed was solid. I asked the only question that fit between tongue and teeth, "How long have you been planning the upgrade?" She flinched, then straightened, smoothing invisible wrinkles from my shirt the way you adjust a picture frame you've already decided to replace. "Not planning," she said. "Hoping, there's a difference," and the word hope floated between us like dust you finally see when sunlight cuts a room in half. I wanted to argue, to remind her of nights we spent poring over blueprints for the house we'd build once the loans were smaller, the night she traced the calluses on my palms and swore success tasted like sawdust and sweat. Instead, I followed her back to the table, where her father was now describing the engagement ring Emmett had apparently chosen with exquisite taste, and I realized the dessert I'd carried was meant for a celebration that had nothing to do with me. I lasted 20 more minutes, long enough to smile when required, to answer questions about the little carpentry business with humble shrugs, to feel every particle of sawdust I'd ever worn being brushed from their lives like crumbs. When the doorbell rang, 2 soft chimes that sounded like a starting gun, I excused myself to the kitchen under the pretense of plating tarts, and watched through the window as Emmett stepped from his German sedan, bouquet in hand, tie the exact shade of Elise's dress. I didn't stay to see her face light up. I'd already seen it in the reflection of the silver lid, in the way her shoulders loosened the moment gravity shifted toward someone her family could brag about without caveats. I slipped out the side entrance, walked the 3 miles home along the river, letting the October wind sand down the edges of a night that had carved its verdict into every joint I'd ever trusted. The apartment above the workshop felt smaller when I returned, smelling of pine shavings and the lavender candle Elise once claimed made her feel safe. I sat on the couch we'd built together, stared at the half-finished hope chest in the corner, and understood for the first time that craftsmanship wasn't only about wood, it was about knowing when the wood said no more weight. Sleep didn't come, instead memories paraded across the ceiling, her father handing me a level and saying, "Measure twice, cut once, if you ever level up," laughter rippling like a secret handshake I wasn't in on, her mother asking if I could maybe refinish the attic for Emmett's office once he and Elise combine households. Each recollection landed like an additional coat of stain, darkening the grain until the pattern revealed itself. I'd never been the future, they'd simply tolerated the present while waiting for delivery. Morning arrived gray and still, the kind of light that shows every swirl in polyurethane, and I found myself at the workbench before coffee, palm resting on the hope chest, feeling the slight warp I'd pretended wasn't there. I picked up the pry bar, hesitated, then began dismantling the piece board by board, nails squealing like testimony no longer willing to stay buried. With every pop of joinery, I rehearsed what I would say when Elise finally came home, because she would, eventually, eyes wide with practiced regret, asking for time, for understanding, for the carpenter to sand himself smoother so the transition would leave no splinters in her family's narrative. But the wood had its own memory, and as the pile of reject boards grew, I recognized the shape taking form beneath my hands. Not a chest, not a hope, but a simple exit ramp, long enough, strong enough, to carry me out of a house whose blueprint had never included my name on the deed.